here with another video, and I'm super excited about this one because in this video I will show you how I made these wonderful handmade paper using no blender, and I did the entire process indoors. So yes, even if you don't have an access to a large sunny yard, or if you don't have the bulky appliance, you can still make handmade paper. Before we jump right in, do take the time to click subscribe, turn on notifications, and give this video a thumbs up. If you've seen my other handmade paper videos, you would know that I always begin with a jar. I find that these glass jars are most handy for storing the pulp. I am using about 5 to 10 sheets each of white and cream colored paper. So these are book pages. So I just cut these sheets of paper using my paper trimmer. I cut them into strips. You can just choose to cut them using scissors or manually rip them. If you have a paper shredder, that would be great as well. But with my paper trimmer, I can do them 2 to 3 sheets at a time, making the process a whole lot faster. If I was using the blender, I would stop at making the strips, but since I'm going to go for a no blender process, I will want to cut the strips to a smaller size so it will be easier to create the pulp later on. So to do this, I just cut them into smaller pieces using the scissors, and I just put all the little squares until the jar is full. Once I've cut up all my sheets, I just add in water into the jar. I fill the whole thing up with water until all the pieces of paper are wet. Then I seal it and leave it to soak overnight, but actually I forgot about this soaking thing and I got a bit busy, so it was soaking in this jar for I think about 3 days. So after 3 days of soaking, this is what the jar looked like. So as you can see, there's some discoloration in the water. I reckon that's from the ink or the paper itself, and it wasn't super soft, but yeah, the papers were more easy to rip apart. So I poured the whole thing into a basin so it would be easier for me to reach in and get the sheets of paper later on. So I just grabbed a couple of the sheets without the paper, just manually draining the paper, and then I started pounding using my mortar and pestle. Since I was on the desk, I couldn't really go full force because the stuff on my desk was shaking, so I decided to continue the whole thing on the floor so I could really pound on the paper and turn them into pulp. So for me to pound the sheets into a pulp, it took a while, maybe about 10 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes for each handful of sheets that I got from the basin. I just kept pounding and grinding the pulp until it had the consistency that I was looking for. So this is what the pulp looked like midway of the pounding session. So I just continued to pound and grind until I got a consistency that I was happy with, and when I was done, I just put in the pulp into the jar, and I grabbed another handful of the soaked sheets and continued and repeated the same process. For reference, the 15 to 20 sheets of paper that I soaked took about an entire Friends episode. So it took me about like 20-25 minutes to complete this whole process. Here is a time-lapse video with a better angle so you can see how I ground up the paper into pulp. This process can give you a textured kind of paper, but if you want a finer or a smoother surface type of handmade paper, you can simply take more time to pound or grind the pulp. But of course, if you want to get really fine sheets of paper, the blender will always be better. But as you have seen at the beginning of this video, the output of this process is still very much acceptable and has a unique character to it. After grinding the entire batch of sheets into pulp, the next step would be to fill up a basin with water and just drop your pulp in there, and you can get started on the paper making process. You can leave the pulp as is, or you can add other elements into the sheet. So this is the part where I like to experiment. I add in dried petals, star confettis, or anything that comes into mind. So I move the pulp and the things around, and I dip my mold and deckle into the basin, and then I just move things around and pull it up, and I have my handmade paper. As you can see, that would more or less be the face of the handmade paper itself. Then I just let the water drip for a bit before I lift off my deckle. For reference, the one with the screen is the mold and the one without is the deckle. Once you've separated the two components, the next step would be to tip the mold onto a cotton sheet or any type of cloth. Others say that you can use newspaper, but what I'm using is this bamboo cotton sheets, which I can definitely reuse. And now you can see on the video, I am pressing behind the screen. I am using a sponge and it helps absorb the excess water from the pulp. And what I've come to learn is that the more water that you absorb, or the drier the pulp is, the easier it would be to lift off the screen. So that's the first sheet done, and I just repeat the whole process again and make more sheets. So I do not add sizing to the paper that I make, but if you're curious about sizing, I have some facts about it in the description. You can read more about it there. So I do it in batches of 4. Now, when I finish an entire sheet of the paper towel, I hang them onto a clothes hanger. I used a bulldog clip to keep them in place. In my other videos, I just left them to dry flat under the sun, but since I'm doing an experiment of doing this indoors with the premise that I do not have enough space to do the full flat drying, so I decided to try out hanging them in a clothes hanger. This is a much more space-saving way to do it, I think. Anyway, I continued making the rest of the pulp into more handmade paper, and this time I added in more elements into the pulp basin. This time I added dried flowers into the mix and also some handmade paper that I made previously. So this is the fun bit where you can get to be as creative as you want. Then I also add in a sheet of gold foil. From my previous videos, I learned that this type of foil, if you rip them out manually by hand, they just crumple up into smaller bits, so you can't really see them on the surface of the sheets. So I decided to try a different method, and I think this worked better. So I just manually poked through the gold foil with a sharp object. I can say that this method worked better because they showed really well on some or most of my handmade paper sheets. When I started making handmade paper, I tried to control and make sure that each sheet had an element or something, but then it was more difficult. And then I realized that just letting the whole thing move around naturally, that's how I get the better patterns. So it's really a fun experiment for me every time, because I'm not a professional handmade paper maker or anything like that, but it's just so fun to create these things, and it's always a surprise every time. But the more I do this craft, the more I gain familiarity with the things that I can and can't incorporate into the mix. and there's also learned muscle memory as well. So I just repeat the whole process until I run out of pulp. Here is a better view of me hanging the sheet in the clothes hanger. So I first hung them inside the room, but then I realized that it was taking a bit longer for them to dry, so I decided to put them up near the window where the sun was and there was like a bit of a breeze. This would have dried faster if I just hung them outside in the balcony or somewhere where there was direct sunlight, but since I'm doing an indoor paper making video, so I just left them out to dry in this manner. It took overnight, so I just slept, and then when I woke up in the morning, these sheets were already dry. As you can see, the sheets started to curl when they were dry. They weren't as flat, I guess, because the moisture has already evaporated. So that's not much of an issue because you can just press down a book on them later on and they will flatten. And so I removed the clips and I removed them from the clothes hanger one at a time. And we come to the most satisfying part of this process, which is peeling off the handmade paper from the cotton sheets. So since I didn't use any binding agent or anything like sizing or other chemicals, I usually expect some of the bits and pieces to fall off, though in my experience this rarely happens. Anyway guys, as you can see, the indoor and no blender paper making method does actually work. From about 10 to 15 sheets of book paper, I was able to yield about 22 pieces of A6 sized sheets. I'm super happy with how these sheets turned out. They are really pretty. I'll be honest with you, not all of them was perfect, but they all turned out super great and I just absolutely adore them. So these are the final sheets that I came up with. What I mean by not perfect, some of the sheets didn't have some of the embellishments that I added in, I guess because sometimes I just like to, go with the flow and see what I come up with. But perhaps if you want to be more consistent about the speckles or the designs or embellishments on each sheet, you really need to find that balance every time you lift your mold and deckle. But anyway, I decided to add one more thing to this video because when I make handmade paper videos or tutorials, I get asked this a lot, is do the sheets bleed when you write on them? You didn't use sizing, so I bet these sheets would bleed. So here is a little ink test for the curious. So I tried using this, I think this is an alcohol based stamp, so I just used it on the sheet directly, and of course because my paper is heavily textured, I think that it didn't render quite well, but it didn't bleed, so there is no bleeding. And then I also tried using it with chalk ink, so this is chalk based ink, and once again there is no bleeding. My stamp was just dirty, that's why there are a lot of black marks around the edges. Next, I tried it with the gel ink. This is a Papermate Ink Joy in 0.7. So again, there was no bleeding when I was using this pen to write on the handmade paper sheet. The only issue I had was the paper was heavily textured. I think this could be because of the kind of cotton sheet that I had, or perhaps because my pulp wasn't as fine. So it was more of an issue with the texture rather than with the ink itself. So as you can see, there is no bleeding. Since I've only been using recycled paper, so book pages, and these pages already have sizing in them, I really don't add sizing, and I guess that's why I don't have an issue with bleeding when I write on these sheets. But again, it would be different depending on the type of paper that you used or you started with. Also, for reference, this is how thick mine came out. So they're not super thin, but they're not super thick as well. They're just like about, say, 100 plus something GSM. Also, as you can see, I didn't really create the pulp so finely, so there are some whole sheets that you can see on the paper. So your final output will really be dependent on how fine you ground up the pulp at the very beginning of this process. But anyway, guys, I'm super happy with how mine turned out, and I hope that this video is informative for you in case you're looking for a resource on how handmade paper is made without the blender indoors. If you do get a chance to make handmade paper of your own, do tag me on Instagram. I'd love to see how yours turned out. If you have any other questions, I have a set of frequently asked questions on handmade paper making in the description. Anyway, thank you so much for making it through till the end of this video. Don't forget to click subscribe and follow me on Instagram as well. I'll see you in the next video. For now, keep safe, stay well. Bye!